Hello, welcome in. My name's David Mitchell, and this is the LGBT Wrestling Podcast.
Celebrate how far we've come from the darker past of it all. Not just in terms of wrestling, but society in general.
You, as a gay performer, don't want to only play up stereotypes, but you also want to represent your community.
The more confident I grew with doing it in front of audiences, the better it's gotten.
Welcome in, everyone. Once again, it is me, your host this week and every week on the LGBT Wrestling Podcast here on BBC Sounds. Me, David Mitchell, and I'm here to bring you a very, very special chat I had this week with the host of the BBC's LGBT Sports Podcast. Not just wrestling like me, he does all the sports. Jack Murley, been a wrestling fan since the early noughties, and of course, proud member of the LGBTQ+ community. We had a good long chat talking about various things about wrestling, our favourite eras of wrestling, people who have influenced us, talked a bit about Shawn Michaels' return, representation in AEW and WWE, even a little bit of Impact. But we've got the best bits for you here now of our good hour chat, and we enter the podcast talking with Jack about his thoughts on the Billy and Chuck situation. Of course, Billy Gunn and Chuck Palumbo at the time were tag team champions in the World Wrestling Federation. Two gentlemen who played a gay tag team who are about to have a commitment ceremony to each other in the ring. Wouldn't be the first time there's been a wedding-like scenario in WWE. They've been doing it for many, many times, of course. The most famous probably being the Macho Man Randy Savage and Elizabeth's in the early 90s. But of course, it didn't quite go as we all hoped, and they called it a publicity stunt and pulled the plug on it in the ring in front of thousands and thousands of the viewing audience across the world, much to the anger and frustration to many members of the LGBTQ+ community. We entered the podcast today with Jack's thoughts about the situation and carry on from there. I hope you enjoy the show, and you'll be hearing more from me in a little while.
When I was growing up, I didn't know enough about myself and my sexuality to know that often people like me were being made the butt of the joke. I didn't know enough about that now. So when I would watch a Billy and Chuck, I didn't realise that sort of the way it was being booked was, this is quite funny, two guys in love, let's get some humour out of that. I didn't know enough. As I became more sophisticated, I would see wrestling angles just made me wince. And as you look back now, where Chris Kanyon came out and had to sing Boy George, and you just felt that, as a wrestling fan now, looking back at that, I felt like I wasn't wanted. I think wrestling's had a significant change. I can remember how I felt when I saw Finn Balor come out at WrestleMania in New Orleans, and he was wearing the Pride colours. And out came this guy, and it wasn't the butt of the joke. It was almost incidental. Here's one of your favourite superstars, and he's wearing Pride colours. And even though I was in my late 20s, early 30s, and happy and content and confident, wow, did that matter? Wow, was that important to see that? When I would see in AEW, Cody coming out in Pride colours, when I would see Anthony Bowens and think, oh, that's Anthony Bowens who is out and open about his boyfriend and his story. It is night and day from where I was when I was growing up.
I heard a story recently from UK independent wrestler Visage. As a non-binary wrestler but wrestles in drag. They explained to me two different sides. She automatically assumed she should play a villain because she was a flamboyant, strutting to the ring, wearing diamantes and big earrings and big eyelashes, because she was a supermodel. Nobody likes a supermodel. You're better looking than we are. Makes sense that a supermodel will get booed. But there were people who started coming to the shows dressed up as her because they saw her just as a big wrestling persona, in the same way that I would have, at my young age, would have watched Hulk Hogan or The Ultimate Warrior, or the way we see The Big Show or The Undertaker. It's just a character who is larger than life. When you're 5, 6, 7 years old, you're probably not really thinking about the LGBT community. All you're thinking about is someone you think looks cool who's wrestling in the wrestling ring in front of you. On the flip side of that, you had when they went to perform at a British holiday resort, and I quote, they said, "Don't do any of that gay S in the ring, please, tonight," before they'd even had a conversation. So while it's celebrated for every one person who thinks it's wonderful, and for every child that dresses like you, there's always going to be one quite narrow-minded person who brings it down for everybody else.
Yeah, and look, I go back to, and this is one of the things I think about a lot, because in the job I do, we talk to people in all different kinds of sport as well as wrestling, and often there is an assumption that people don't come out in their particular sport because there's a problem with the sport. And what I try and say to people is, coming out, if you've not done it, you don't do it just once, you do it multiple times. You may come out to a friend, to a colleague, then to a few people, then you might come out on your social, so you do it a lot. There are lots of reasons why you may not come out. And often one of the reasons people don't come out is they still don't feel comfortable in society, separate from what their career or their sport is. when you are choosing to be who you are in wrestling, one of the reasons you may not be your authentic self may be nothing to do with wrestling. It may be because of what's going on in society. And someone who gets told at a wrestling event, we don't want to see that gay ... here, may well have heard that in the street. They may well have seen someone look at them holding hands with their significant other and seen eyebrows raised, or had comment. Does it surprise me it goes on in wrestling? No, because it goes on in society.
I've often found it quite bizarre in wrestling, any level of toxicity, when wrestling itself is so inherently flamboyant and campy. And if you go back to the 70s, when wrestling was perceived to be real, it was, okay, we're the toughest guys, we're going to fight each other, and it did have that kind of like air of like macho-ness around it. Whereas now we know so much more about what it is as a performance, like in the art form. It's basically soap opera acting, but with flying elbows thrown in there as well. The fact that you kind of have that weird toxic masculinity amongst it is just bizarre to me. I've never quite understood where this comes from.
No, and I don't understand it either, because on that one level, it is theatre, isn't it? It's theatre, it's art, it's artistic, and quite often you're doing it in your underwear as well. So you would think that people would have fewer reasons to be quite so uptight, quite so tightly wound, quite so set in their ways. The other thing is, some of the toughest people in wrestling have been members of the LGBTQ plus community and not flamboyant in the slightest. Now, there's absolutely nothing wrong with being an out flamboyant person and a member of the LGBTQ plus community. I don't think anyone would accuse Pat Patterson of being that sort of wrestler, yet he was never shy about sharing stories about his sexuality with his colleagues. That San Francisco street fight that people talk about that he's been in, you know, the ones at Madison Square Garden, he was one of the toughest guys around and a gay man. I think part of it comes down to where society was as well. I think that Pat was wrestling in the 70s, in the 80s. Society was a different place there, and therefore wrestling was a different place. And I think as society changes, wrestling is changing as well. But you're right, it does seem bizarre that of all the industries you can work in, wrestling, with all the things that make it unique and a spectacle, is the one where there is that toxicity.
Do you think then that wrestling is quite a good mirror to society as it comes to acceptance and representation, or do you think perhaps it's further ahead or further behind as far as like a mirror to actual society?
I think it's really hard to know, but I sort of trace my own development as I look at wrestling, and they seem to be sort of at the same sort of level. We were talking about Billy and Chuck earlier, you know, that was 20 years ago. You'd never see a Billy and Chuck angle now, for example, because society has changed. Same-sex marriage is widely accepted around the world, therefore they couldn't pull that kind of stunt now. You see more and more people just being out and open about their sexuality in their personal lives, in general, and I think you see that in wrestling as well. And I think one way you see it is actually, quite often, wrestlers aren't, quote, coming out because they're not in. And we see that a lot in society as well. Folks who are on social media who've never said, oh, by the way, I'm gay, because you look at their social media and it's clear they have a boyfriend or a girlfriend. And I think you see that mirrored in wrestling as well, where sexuality is almost incidental. But for me, it does seem much of a muchness. It seems like wrestling has kept pace with society, and maybe wrestling had further to go to get to where we are now. So I think it's a really interesting topic. But can I be honest about Billy and Chuck? Again, being a less sophisticated fan at the time, when you are LGBTQ+ and you're growing up, you're looking for anything at all to make you not feel alone. You're looking for any representation of someone who feels the way you feel. And for all the faults with the Billy and Chuck storyline, the idea that there could be a commitment ceremony between two men on TV made me feel a little bit better about myself. As a teenager who wasn't very sophisticated, who didn't see me anywhere, it made me think, okay, at least the conversation's being had in a cack-handed, clunky way. And I gotta be honest, I think mostly because of Eric Bischoff, I love the angle where it all comes apart, because I think that is one of the greatest wrestling angles of all time, where Eric Bischoff pulls off the latex face when he says, or 3 minutes, and it all kicks off. So I find it quite a complicated thing to talk about, because I love the payoff. It made me feel a bit better about myself, but when you look back, it is problematic in so many ways, it almost feels bad to say that.
Is it one of those situations where perhaps poor representation is better than no representation, because at least there's an acknowledgement there.
Yeah, I think that may well be it. And it was just, for me, the idea that these two men were in some sort of relationship, quote, and I didn't get the nudge, the wink, wink. I didn't get the humour because I was too young. I was unsophisticated in getting it.
Sonny Kiss, gender fluid, represents both male and female genders. Only ever seen wrestling men. Non-binary characters, wrestling, they're out-facing gender, I guess. If you were born male and you're non-binary, you'll generally face guys and vice versa. How do you think that could be changed, and where do you see that heading?
I think that if you treat wrestling as storytelling, as art, there is no reason why you shouldn't have intergender wrestling. In the same way, there was no reason why Buffy the Vampire Slayer should not be mixing it up with male and female protagonists. I don't see why you shouldn't have it. But for me, it all comes down to story. Can you tell a compelling story? Is it something the audience want to see? If it is, then I think go for it. I also think it is just great that we are seeing more people like Sonny Kiss on screen, where their gender fluidity, their unwillingness to conform, or frankly the fact they don't give a damn about conforming to what people previously thought, is part of their character, is great, is really, really cool.
One of the arguments I've heard against it is they don't want their wrestling to come across like a snuff movie. I mean, we go back to the Brock Lesnar introduction to wrestling when he was a SmackDown as the WWE champion, and he was facing Zach Gowen and Stephanie McMahon. An absolute monster in Brock Lesnar, destroying someone. Now, obviously that instance, he's destroying a woman and someone with one leg. Basically turns into a snuff film at that point. And the argument I've heard against that happening would be to do it in like weighted divisions, much like the UFC has done. But of course, by doing that, you are taking away wonderful opportunities for storytelling. So I think it more depends on what variety of wrestling you like, as opposed to being against the intergender mindset of wrestling.
Absolutely, and I would agree. I think that you should not be putting on a product that is exploitative of anything to make ratings or money. You shouldn't be doing that. And if you were to sit down a non-wrestling fan and put that on for them, it would be an uncomfortable watch, and there would be difficult questions to answer.
So there it is. That's the best bits from my chat with Jack Murley, good friend of the show. Hope you enjoyed that one. Please go and check out the LGBT Sports podcast that Jack hosts. You never know, maybe I'll be a guest on there one day. I hope you've enjoyed your time here today. Of course, if you are new here, you can find us every week on BBC Sounds. My name's been David Mitchell, and you've been listening to the LGBT Wrestling Podcast.